digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Laura from E1, Lance Weiler and Andrew from the Difference Engine, creators of The Heist. We're going to start by hearing from each of our guests about where they're from, starting with Laura.
I'm based out in the UK and I head up development for film, and our recent productions include Women in Black 2, Suite Française, and upcoming horror films Sinister 2 and Insidious 3.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Laura.
That's me.
And Lance, why don't you tell us more about your illustrious career?
Yes, my name is Lance Weiler. I am a storyteller. I've worked for the last 20 years in film and television and gaming. Very interested in how stories can be more pervasive and kind of spill off of a screen and into the real world and back. Also the founding member and director of the Digital Storytelling Lab at Columbia University. And I also serve as the director of experiential learning and applied creativity at the university, where we're kind of experimenting with the future of work and learning using story, play, and design.
Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing over at Difference Engine?
Yeah, hi, my name is Andrew Somerville. I'm one of the two founders of Difference Engine, and we make worlds that respond to people as they enter them and the things that they do. So we create great big immersive experiences which are fundamentally altered and put the audience in the position of being the hero.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, guys. So today what we want to talk about is the scope of immersive entertainment, from immersive gaming through to immersive theatre and immersive filmmaking, because I feel like there is a very interesting evolving landscape that we're seeing emerge here, where mainstream theatrical release is now beginning to recognise the value of certain aspects of immersive entertainment, but also certainly the use of ARG, for example, as marketing campaign methodology. And I am curious to hear, so certainly starting with you, Andrew, in your experiences so far, whether you feel like the mainstream is ready for immersive entertainment at this stage, or if you still feel it's a very niche market at the moment.
Oh, that's an easy one. I think that the audience is ready, but we're not quite at the moment. I think that the demand is way outstripping the ability of people with the expertise to actually deliver. I'm sure we definitely feel stretched to kind of create experiences and content at the pace that people kind of want at the moment, and I think you can kind of see the pull of that in every single field at the moment. You know, in theatre, definitely seeing this huge shift towards immersive elements. You're seeing it in marketing campaigns. You're seeing it just about everywhere. The demand is there for immersive experiences. It's actually us that's lagging behind almost.
And how would you suggest that we approach that skill gap, perhaps, or that resource gap that we have at the moment? Lance, from your perspective, what do you think are the key things that we need to address within the industry?
Well, I think one thing is to really kind of make sure that it's you're focusing on the story, right? It like in a lot of ways, the story is the same. It's the telling that's changing, and so I think finding a way that you can allow somebody to experience the emotional core of what it is that you're trying to put forward. So in a lot of respects, I think being able to kind of find methods that allow for the kind of the combination of story and code, and both those have very different development cycles. So I think being able to spend time to assess a project and really drive it from the core of what you're trying to say and what that voice is, and then being very cognizant of what the person that's stepping into it, what you want them to feel emotionally throughout that whole the whole journey that they go on. So I think in terms of the skill sets, it's really understanding that we have a major shift that's happening where teams that you're working with are diversifying. And a lot of the times it's trying to find grammar that allows you to communicate effectively with these new types of roles, whether it be data scientists, whether it be creative technologists, whether it be, on the traditional side, if you're coming back, working with producers or directors or production designers or DPs. So I think some of it is really kind of taking the time to immerse yourself in some of these new opportunities. But I see the real challenge is really finding that common grammar that allows you to make sure that you're communicating in an effective manner, to make sure that you're not burning resources or time or compromising the vision that you have.
I think this is quite an interesting conversational point, in as much as I know that Laura, you and I have had conversations in the past where we've been speaking about this kind of new grammar or new language that needs to occur in order to allow this kind of transitionary development process to occur. From your perspective, from pure traditional film perspective, what do you see as being the key kind of milestones or hurdles maybe that need to be overcome here?
I think it's greater connections between industry and creators at an earlier point, because I think very much we were saying before that audiences want to interact and they want new experiences and they want to see content in different ways and on different platforms. But the industries, and I think film especially, are sort of trapped in their old models that work along very particular systems. And I think there's a kind of, people are sort of nervous to break out and put money towards research and experimenting and looking at new ways of doing things. So I think really it's greater interactivity between the industry and looking at sort of new ways of breaking down those old models to bring new content to audiences.
I hear you in as much as bringing content to new audiences, but I'm kind of curious, and Andrew, maybe you have more to say on this, because I know that you kind of are working very much in the theatrical space. But I feel like there's this kind of indecisiveness in the path that the development is taking. And I say this in terms of the difference between your experience, which is things like The Heist that you've done, which is very much immersive theatre. It's very much allowing the audience, the individual, to define the outcome of what happens, and therefore you have multiple outcomes, and it's very much a game design almost in terms of the experience. But then you have immersive theatre in the form of things like Generation of Z, which is very much immersive theatre experience in as much as you observe. You don't interact with the actors. You don't interact necessarily with the aspect of story. You're very much there as a spectator rather than a participant. And I wonder how far down the line we are able to see this this nature of interaction and influence over storyline really happening, and whether or not there is truly a kind of a collaborative space of storytelling development that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's scope for all kinds of different models. Coming from the background that we do, which is we made a lot of theatre before we started Difference Engine. We owed a huge amount to companies like Punch Drunk, who really kicked down the doors for huge, massive scale immersive performances. But they were very much about observation. They were about choosing the viewpoint. We flatter ourselves almost in that we're trying to, as we see it, take it to its next logical step, which is about building a world that's so convincing because not just it's all surrounding you in an immersive sense, but that it interacts with you like the real world does, or like a world that you might want to invent. But there are all of these kind of skill sets and spaces which are opening up. And really, I think what we're seeing is a kind of a simultaneous convergence on this idea that actually the audiences are not as happy to just sit back and consume in the ways that they were. You see this reflected in declining cinema going figures in general. If people want to sit back, they'll sit back at home and they're comfortable with that experience. When they go out, they want something more. They want something that you can only gain through physical interaction or digital interaction, or in some kind of additional experience, which is not so easy to put a label on. And we're all coming at this from different directions, from all of these different kind of content spheres. And we're all, there's a certain amount of cynical kind of are immersives really in right now? But then there's genuine moves from like computer games and kind of the alternative gaming community to alternative reality games, especially sort of move into more theatrical and film type spaces, and theatre is branching out in the same kind of way. So we're all trying to, I feel, converge on this thing, which is that the audience wants a more convincing, more elaborate, more exciting, more tangible, and more emotional connection to the artistic content than they have before.
What's your take on that, Lance?
Well, I think that one thing that's really kind of interesting about right now and the time that we sit in is that a lot of people are really their own kind of media companies. They're able to push button publish for the world to see, and whether somebody's watching or not is a different story. But I think one thing that's really interesting about that is the opportunity, the barriers to entry are greatly reduced. So our relationship to stories are changing. And as a result, when I go and I start to craft a project that I'm working on, there's like usually 4 key things that I'm kind of addressing within it. I'm thinking about how it can be social in some way. And when I mean social, I mean it's spread, it has a spreadability to it. I want it to be connected, meaning that it actually is connecting people in a meaningful way, whether they're physically there, whether it's like local and global at the same time. And they're connecting in a meaningful way that it has some kind of agency within the experience itself. Then the other side of it is this way in which it's pervasive. How can it spill from one screen onto another, from one device to another? And then the last is like kind of about the personalization of it. And I think where we sit right now is we sit in this emerging area where the personalization of media is going to become more and more important. And you see it just very basically with media consumption. You see it in the way that people are binge watching TV, and you see it in the way that certain devices are carried on individuals and they use those devices. And you look at it how cable is unbundling itself currently, and you look at things like HBO Go, and you look at just these different interesting ways in which people are saying, well, it's about where I want it, how I want it. And I think that on-demand culture is naturally going to flow into the side of more personalization within those entertainment experiences. Some of that might be in a curatorial sense. Some of that might be in a direct, having agency within an experience itself, which borrows a little bit from gaming or borrows from immersive theater. But I think the other side of that is really that social connected side. And so, when I'm kind of looking at it, I'm very excited about those opportunities and the way in which, it often feels like to me that we're in the silent era right now of these new emergent forms. And similar to how, during the silent film era, they would set a tripod up with a camera and shoot a stage with actors. And then one day somebody, said, hey, why don't we take the camera off the tripod and go outside? And they started to shape the language of what cinema is. I think we're in a similar moment, where the fragmentation makes it challenging, but at the same time, there are no rules, which makes it incredibly exciting. But at the same time, there are no exact business models as of yet, which makes it frustrating.
Indeed, very frustrating. And I'm curious, Laura, from your perspective.
Yeah.
I think that there is perhaps some frustration from the kind of typical theatrical end of the spectrum here, in as much as you are very reliant on outcomes that really do happen in a traditional theatre, a cinema, and how much of what you do from a content perspective is something that is, first of all, something that can be translated into a social, personable, contextual experience that can be shared beyond the theatre, versus how much do you really want to see happen within the theatre? Because obviously that detracts somewhat from the original purpose of the format and the original purpose of the experience. I'm curious as to just how far down the line typical theatre development or cinema development is really willing to go.
To be honest, I think sort of traditional development at the moment, as I was saying before, it's kind of in those models is you're looking at theatrical, you're looking at traditional distribution models, and then you're looking at the content and how much people are going to invest in the content to sort of push it through those models in that sense. And that's how everyone kind of works out how much to invest. And then there's obviously the sort of the competition for the talent as well. So I think in cinema, you're seeing much more exploration in the marketing in terms of sort of interactive content that audiences can get involved with and then take away, and that brings in things that we're doing with the Oculus Rift as well. But it's all still very much sort of after the film's been created in that sense. It's then building the world from that point on once you have the audience there. I think what's interesting and what we'd sort of like to start doing more is bringing the audience in at an early stage and sort of bringing that interactivity into it at an early stage. But it's still a very untested area at the moment.
I suppose from a development perspective, just in context of what you're saying, is you're talking about opening up that experience much earlier into the creative development process and kind of the decision-making processes, if you like, of that story and that development and the key decisions that you're making with that universe or that world. And I'm curious because obviously the nature of storytelling and the nature of creativity often requires that there is a singular vision or a singular vision holder, whether that is the director, the producer, or similar. When you're talking about something that has that degree of immersiveness, that degree of collaboration with a social audience, there is obviously a certain degree of control that is then lost at what is essentially a very key stage in the development process. And I'm curious to hear the thoughts really on whether or not that's something that we think people will be willing to let go of, whether or not that's something that they're willing to share with the audience. And I say this on the basis that, and some people may disagree with me on this one, but generalistically what we're getting into here is closer to what is known as UGC or user-generated content. And invariably when we put the safety of creative content in the hands of a mass audience or a mainstream audience, it tends to become part of the lowest common denominator, or what might some refer to as quite low quality. So I'm curious as to where that balance, that line lies.
Yeah, I think if audiences, if you're talking about them as creators, I think at a very early stage that is difficult. So you're talking about developing IP and a world that sort of audiences want to be involved in. You need that initial idea there to start with, and I think that does need a certain level of control over it. So I think it's sort of worlds can really open out at a sort of later marketing distribution stage. But I think at the initial content creation stage, that is difficult.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on that?
I think that the work we're trying to make is in recognition that relationship between consumer and producer is not zero sum. So whilst Laura's completely right, there is a certain amount of control that you have to give up of your artistic vision going in. You do have to give up the idea that you can control every single perspective that can exist for your work. But I don't think that's necessarily destructive. And to go, to what Lance was saying, he was pointing out that the personalization is going to be an important aspect. With shows like Heist, no two shows are the same. That's the ultimate level of personalization for us, not necessarily for everyone, but for us, we're really aiming at the show that you experience is not the same as anyone else's, and that's because of you being there has changed it. In terms of the being focused on the audience as well, it is really about their experience. And I was completely nodding along vigorously with Lance when he was talking about that, because it was that's definitely kind of what we try and live by. When we make our work, we start out with an artistic vision, but tied up in that artistic vision is the idea that yes, there's this narrative over the top. There's our story that we're trying to tell, but almost more important is that has to frame a whole set of stories that the audience can tell themselves within that framework. And that interaction between the world that we've created and the ways that they're interacting with it and the stories that they're trying to tell within that world is incredibly beneficial to both of them. So, within Heist, yes, there was this big, narrative plot about betrayal and about kind of revenge and the classic kind of heist tropes. But when you spoke to people, they engaged with the characters. They loved the kind of they all had different favorites. Some people sided. The actors treated it as being competitive. They wanted the audience to basically side with them, and they kept scoreboards behind stage, right? Of who was doing, who had basically won over the most audiences. And then when you spoke to them afterwards, the victories that they had. The tiny victories, what we talk about, are when they hid from the guards and the guards didn't find them. Like they were a hair's breadth away from being caught and they got away with it. Those narratives within the world, they just empower the entire thing, and they enhance the experience on every single level to a degree that I think it warrants giving up that small level of control. And when we talk about business models that try and come out of this, traditional intellectual property is not very good at kind of coping with user-generated elements or frameworks like that. But fundamentally, there are the frameworks that are being developed. That's a certain level of intellectual property. And in terms of the business model, from my personal experience, we capitalized our show as a proof of concept, right? We put in £3,000 at the beginning, and it was meant to run for 3 weeks. We were still there 9 months later, and hundreds of thousands of pounds later. Not of profit, because all of that money went back into making sure that the show could keep on going, because we were live directing it every night. But fundamentally, that's not an unsustainable business model. It's a different one, and it's a chaotic one. But from our perspective, we have a motto of embrace the chaos. Chaotic narrative is a thing, and we very much believe in it.
What's your view on that, Lance?
Oh, well, I think that fundamentally one of the biggest challenges is that the entertainment industry is lousy at R&D, lousy at research and development, right? And they don't really put any money into it. And in fact,
I agree with that.
in fact, most of the burden tends to fall on a creator in some ways, and it becomes more and more challenging as the work goes forward. And I think being able to take like little bets. There's a wonderful book by Peter Sims which is called Little Bets, and within the book he embeds in Pixar, and he talks about how Pixar started as a software company, and how they got frustrated because people weren't using the software in a way that they felt could be used to tell stories, and so they ended up starting Tell Stories, and kind of where that ended up, but within that culture of Pixar, they have a very like a yes and kind of thing, which anybody that's ever worked with actors is familiar with, that improv kind of element, like where you're kind of yes and you're trying to improve something. The moment that you say no and but, you kind of kill the scene, and so I think in a lot of ways the R&D aspect of being able to kind of derive new models and try new things and develop has shrunk away, because the pools of money that used to be there for the development of even writing or prepping something, you're asked more and more to go further and further, whether it's to do the previs on something, whether it's to work out the series arc across 4 seasons, whether it's to, you're doing more and more on the front end, shoot something short, demonstrate that you have an audience, crowdfunding, like all these things that you're kind of required before you can kind of move into the market. And so I think in a lot of ways there's a permission-based culture thing, and there's kind of getting beyond that permission-based culture, and some of the intellectual property and the law that currently exists globally makes it more challenging to do work. We're experimenting right now with a 12-month project at the Digital Storytelling Lab called Sherlock Holmes and the Internet of Things, and it's a retelling of Sherlock Holmes. A reimagining that what we know is that in early October, we'll be premiering something at Lincoln Center in New York. We have no idea what it's going to be yet, but we do monthly meetups, and a diverse group of people have come together from all different walks of life to start to tackle what could be a really interesting experience that happens at Lincoln Center. So it's a geolocative story, but at the same time, it goes into a massive online course, which is free, where people can come in and learn about story and design and rapid prototyping. And we just announced that this past week, and anybody can request an application to apply to it. But the project really at its core is about kind of building an R&D environment where we're saying, look, we're going to open this project up. Sherlock Holmes is in the global public domain. So let's experiment with co-ownership, co-authorship. Let's experiment with the policy, ethical issues, and the realities of what the Internet of Things means. And let's use story as a way to drive technology as opposed to technology shaping humanity. And in a way, the project's been really fascinating because there's a certain part where people have to kind of almost detach themselves from the ways that they're used to working, and the ways that they're used to things being siloed. And we build these very collaborative environments that are design-based that allow people to have a voice, but have a very clear kind of purpose to what we're doing and are moving the R&D process forward on that particular project. So a lot of it is like looking at how we're using data within the projects that we do, how we're measuring the impact of what we're doing, and just being more aware of this reality that those formerly known as the audience are now rapidly becoming collaborators, and that there's a major shift that's happening within the industry where as we move to a world where we do not own things anymore and we just continually license them or have subscriptions, that it really becomes this interesting thing. Whereas, is there a place where the audience actually then starts to step in and take on a role that was never possible before? And I think we tend to think about the audience in those terms, that they are there to help us in terms of marketing, in terms of distribution. But I think the reality is that, as was mentioned earlier, they're more than ready and willing to things that they're passionate about, to be involved in something that is an ongoing experience. And Punch Drunk was referenced earlier in the process, in the conversation, and it's a wonderful, like I've gone to Sleep No More a couple different times, and one of my favorite moments in that whole process is after it's done, is in the moments where you're sitting with the people that you went with, and you're separated, and you're talking about these experiences that you've had, but they have a thematic frame. So you were all in the same place, but you saw something different than I saw, and what happened to you, and it's a very dynamic conversation, and in a lot of ways, it's more engaging and exciting than even the theatrical performance that you had gone through. So I think when we start to realize the role of the audience and those formerly known as the audience, I think a lot of the business models will be unlocked from there, and I think a lot of challenges are presented because of it. But I think that there's tremendous value when we start to embrace more of an R&D approach.
I completely agree with so much of what you're saying, that it's making me very, very happy. But you touched on one thing that I love, which is the yes and kind of nature. Saying yes and in directorial terms is very, very important. I think now we're moving into a time where it's being very yes and to the audience. It's not about rejecting anything that the audience comes to you with about your whatever the content is, whatever the kind of environment is. It's about saying yes to that and making something collaboratively better, so that the audience are collaborating with each other and with you in order to create an experience which really works. And I think the age of the kind of the slightly autistic auteur is coming to an end, and it's a much more collaborative kind of environment that we're really entering now.
Indeed. So guys, I want to thank you all very, very much for taking the time out today to join us on this digital jam session. Before we part company, I would like to ask you each to just shout out for me your Twitter handle or your website, or whichever way or form of communication you would prefer the audience to be able to follow up with you. So starting with Laura.
It's just Laura Wilson04 on Twitter.
Okay, and Lance?
At Lance Weiler for Twitter.
Wonderful. And Andrew?
Probably best place is at Difference Engine. Only one E in the middle.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for listening today. If you want to hear more of these digital jam sessions, don't forget to subscribe today. In the meantime, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation with Lance, Laura and Andrew, listen in to next week's episode. digitaljamsessions.com